So let's start. I would propose we have now 12 participants and 15. We are 15 minutes too late. We have the last session with 2 lectures, and I will present both together, and we will have a common discussion at the end. And at the end, Francisco and I will give you some information with regard to a possible publication, a digital one, and maybe one as a printed book. I started with María Belforte. We have got to know her chairing the first session. Thank you again. She's a researcher at Conicet, that is the National Council for Scientific and Technical Research in Argentine. But she's also linked, as she told me, connected with the University of Buenos Aires, where she gained her PhD in philosophy. So we have now a philosopher and not only a literary theoretic or a cultural theoretic, a pure philosopher. She has made her PhD with a thesis on Walter Benjamin, and she teaches European intellectual history at the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters at the University of Buenos Aires. She is the author of Política de la embriaguez, Infancia, Amor y Muerte en el Proyecto Político de Walter Benjamin. And she works also together with Francisco Gafijczuk, my partner in the workshop, and edited and translated La Guerra y la Vida, Escritos Bellicista by Georg Simmel. Francisco has mentioned this not very easy texts with regard of our political positions, maybe. And the second is Dariusz Gafijczuk, an old companion and a friend of mine, and so a friend for me. He's a lecturer in sociology in the School of Geography, Politics, Sociology at the University of Newcastle in the United Kingdom. And I mentioned also some books. As far as I see, these are digital books or books that are also digitally available. The first one is Identity, Aesthetics and Sound in the Fin de Siècle, Redesigning and Perception. And the second is a book together with another colleague, Sayer, The Inhabited Ruins of Central Europe, Reimagining. I think you are the editor of that book, Dariusz, or is this a monograph together with?
Yeah, it's an edited collection.
It's edited. I think I remember we discussed about that topic also in Lancaster. I think.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's been a long standing.
And I spoke about Simmel and Foucault in that symposium.
I think so. Yeah.
The title of Maria's conferencia, her paper is From Simmel to Benjamin, Utopian Traces of a Political Reading. Please, Maria, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks, you both, Professor Müller-Funk and Francisco, and I'm very happy to be part of this workshop. And well, I'll read my presentation, and afterwards we have some time to clarify things if they are not so clear if I read too fast. The intersection between Georg Simmel's and Walter Benjamin's philosophies has not remained uncharted, even the extensive bibliography devoted to their studies. However, the examination of the relation between them has been mainly laid out by the academically hegemonic analysis about modernity and culture. This is, its political implications in a broad sense have been partly limited to specific aspects in relation to Marxist theory. The magnitude of the contrast between the two thoughts has been many times marginalized by general studies of the intellectual history of political theory. The great amount of secondary literature about Benjamin's work has focused on aspects less related to his political project and only some studies have considered the importance of the construction of a utopian political project in his thought, and how Marxist concepts are resignified in his philosophy. Similarly, Benjamin's response to Simmel in his work and project still calls for an analysis in political terms. In this regard, an approach is hereby proposed which distinguishes the philosophical and political foundations of both intellectuals as critical work that, through contrast, sheds light on each of them. Simmel's influence as a teacher and as an intellectual figure on Benjamin has been decisive. As part of his academic training, the latter attends the formal lessons at the Friedrich Wilhelm Universität in Berlin. The presence of Simmel's thought explicitly appears in different writings that lead to making room for the political reading with which Benjamin responds to it, especially as from his political turn by the mid-20s. On the one hand, in Das Passagenwerk, Benjamin's quotes from Simmel's work and references to it are numerous. There, Benjamin recovers passages from the philosophy of money and philosophische Kultur. The topics he evokes are various: fashion, life in the great city, physiognomy, manual work, truth, etc. The diversity and the relevance with which Benjamin tackles these themes in the context of his most important intellectual project prove how central Simmel's philosophy is in his work. On the other hand, a particular reconsideration of some specific aspects show how it is in an openly political direction that he resignifies his teacher's sociology and philosophy. Not only does Benjamin quote and appropriate Simmel's texts, but he also turns them into a dialogical starting point of other elements in his political project. As with each author he recovers, he works on concepts by clarifying notions alien to the only direction in his task, and by resignifying those whose political potential he deems valuable. It is worth remembering that what Benjamin tells Scholem in a letter in 1924. He wishes for, a quotation, a politics within himself, end of quotation. The first clue to this reading is the explicit acknowledgement of Simmel as a precursor of a political revolutionary tendency. Different instances in the critical bibliography about Benjamin recover the following phrase, which is his answer to Adorno, who criticizes him for quoting Simmel in his essay about Baudelaire in 1939. Quotation from Benjamin. Regarding your skeptical view of Simmel, isn't it time he got some respect as one of the ancestors of cultural Bolshevism? End of quotation. Thus, one of the main difficulties in the relation between Simmel's work and Benjamin's is the excessive emphasis laid on the micrological element of the latter response. The phenomenon of the surface, the fragment, methodologically recovered by Benjamin, is not an aspect that excludes a universal aspiration for a major project. The fact that the fragment contains elements of a totality does not turn it into the basis of his philosophy, or even less, of his political project. On the contrary, it dialectically relates to such a project. In this sense, it is necessary to acknowledge the dialectical dynamics of Benjamin's materialism, for which the archaeological method is subordinated to a transcendental objective, to awaken through matter the dormant forces of a yet unwritten history. The passage from the tragic to the political. At least three relevant concepts support Benjamin's distance from Simmel: life, subject, and culture. Evidently, they are not the only elements in his thought that detach him from Simmel, but the three of them possess a distinctive axis that sets them, as in a constellation, in the direction of a historical political perspective. In this sense, it is important to recall the explicit political objective of Das Passagenwerk, to produce, quotation, a Copernican revolution in historical perceptions. Politics attains primacy over history, end of quotation. Life is the first concept that illustrates Benjamin's distance from Simmel's thought. As from the mid-20s, after beginning the first sketches of his project about the arcades, Benjamin's notion of life does not appear as a metaphysical category, but as a concept anchored in the criticism of abstract bourgeois humanism. In fact, Benjamin tends to mistrust the concept of life and its derivatives, and his philosophy pays special attention to the use and abuses of this concept in regressive literary and philosophical tendencies. In this sense, a decisive and symptomatic point that distances Benjamin from Simmel is the respective relationships with the thinkers in Stefan Georg's circle. Benjamin enters into a critical dialogue with figures such as Friedrich Gundolf, Ludwig Klages, Max Kommerer, and Georg himself. Through his criticism, Benjamin always drops up an exchange which recovers many of their categories, clarified in that constant exercise of redeeming the images and words put forward in his philosophy. A summary of Benjamin's distance from the circle, with which Benjamin has a closer, though controversial, relationship, can be observed in this passage from his review of Der Dichter als Viewer in the Deutschen Klassik. Quotation. The authentic image may be old, but the authentic idea is new. It is of today. Admittedly, this today may be paltry, but whatever form it takes, our task is to seize it by the horns so that we can interrogate the past. It is the bull whose blood must fill the grave if the spirits of the departed are to appear at its age. It is this deadly thrust of ideas that is absent from the works of the Georg circle. Instead of offering up sacrifices to the present, they avoid it. Every critic must contain some militant element. It, too, knows the demon of battle. A critic that is nothing but vision loses its way and deprives literature of the interpretation it owes it and of the right to grow. End of quotation. In relation to Georg, Benjamin identifies an intimate connection between the philosophy of money and Simmel's closeness to the circle, as it is suggested by an exchange with Adorno. Quotation, I recently had a look at his philosophy of money. Certainly, it is no accident that Simmel dedicated the book to Reinhold and Sabine Lepsius. And it is no accident that he wrote it right around the time he was allowed to approach the Georg circle. End of quotation. The concept of life, as well as its philosophical derivatives, work in Benjamin's thought as an absent reference around which a set of conceptual constellations is constructed that compete against the regressive nature of the dominant worldview in Germany. Das Passagenwerk presents a historical concept of life, deprived of metaphysical or transcendental elements as a dominant sense. Quotation. In other words, just as Gideon teaches us to read off the basic features of today's architecture in the buildings erected around 1850, we, in turn, would recognize today's life, today's forms, in the life and in the apparently secondary lost forms of that epoch. End of quotation. In order to recover the concept of life in Benjamin's late work, it is thus necessary to reconstruct the process of destruction to which his philosophy submits such a notion. This reconstruction relies on uncovering the regressive metaphysical foundations that support it, a task which reveals a historical materialist concept of the notion of life. The notion of subject is the second decisive concept in the distinction between Simmel's and Benjamin's philosophies. The transposition from the singular individual to universal categories of the human is one of the marks that distinguishes Benjamin from Simmel when analyzing the phenomenon of alienation. The concept of the individual subject is marginalized, if not absent, in Benjamin's mature philosophy. It is replaced by the collective subject and the concern about the universal concept of the human being, as it appears in his essay about Karl Kraus. Benjamin does not explore the theme of the individual, as his philosophy relies on an early rejection of the bourgeois thought and its categories. The individual and free subject against the collective subject is for young Benjamin the Philistine of culture. Very early, he tackles this concept to show its regressive spirit. Quotation, nothing is so hateful to the Philistine as the dreams of his youth, end of quotation. This subject, adapted to institutions and social certainties, is rejected as a category of analysis at an early stage. It is replaced by an existential perspective of the human that always relies on an aspiration to the universal and the collective. Benjamin sketches a profoundly anti-bourgeois philosophical anthropology fed by the youth movement and nurtured by the surrealism and the tradition of the 19th century French poetry. Culture is the third metamorphosized category in Benjamin's thought. Benjamin recovers it implicitly from a historical revolutionary perspective. Although he continues his analysis along the lines of the subject-object dynamics, the notion of tragedy is substituted with utopian elements that dissolve it. In his essay about the work of art, Benjamin takes notes about the relation between what he calls first nature and second nature. The latter is identified with technical and social structures, the former with bodily and existential aspects of the reproduction and the end of life. This is love and death. This characterization can be interpreted as a re-elaboration of the concept objective culture and subjective culture. Benjamin thus excludes categories such as Innerlichkeit, Bildung, or Persönlichkeit, related to the concept of the individual, and puts forward a universal reading of the human. This conceptual distance between subjective culture and first nature shows the passage towards a utopian political perspective on the problem of the relation between the exteriorization of collective forms and the subjective reappropriation of those objective forms. Besides, the very same objectification of culture is for Benjamin an act of barbarism that documents class and domination relationships. The historical materialist perspective can be seen here, a perspective not anchored in the individual subject, but in the collective one. Thus, as opposed to Simmel, who envisages a break due to the outbursts of the First World War, in the dynamics between the exteriorization of the humans and the subjective inwardness, Benjamin analyzes these dynamics departing from the Russian revolutionary experience and the rise of Nazism in Germany. As it will be shown, this analysis is rooted in a political reading supported by utopian elements that correspond to an anthropological materialist conception far from Simmel's thought. Unlike Simmel, because of evident question of historical response, Benjamin is familiar with Marx on the Yiddish question and the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. From this text, he recovers a criticism to liberal law and the consequent liberal humanist conception as they appear in his study about Karl Kraus and in quotations from the Archive Project. He thus thinks of the process of the construction of culture from this perspective of revolutionary political movements. The categories of first and second nature. The presence of the utopian component in Benjamin's political conception determines the definite distance between his philosophy and Simmel's. In the context of production of his project about the arcades, Benjamin recovers the idea present in young Marx that the human is related to the projection of desires of emancipation and transformation to the political redeeming projection. In fact, a phrase from an 1843 letter to Ruge is quoted in an epigraph in the convolute N, whose topic is theory of knowledge, theory of progress. The movement of the subjective exteriorization produces and is produced by desires and desirative embodiments. Not only are they materializing forms that become independent and face the subjectivity that gives them origin, but they also carry with them the forms of a new world and an emancipating dream. The critical task thus implies, quotation, awakening the consciousness of the dream about oneself. The work on 19th century forms, the study about the arcades in Paris, in which Benjamin sets out to revise the prehistory of the 20th century, aims at recovering the material configurations of the dreams of the 19th century bourgeoisie. In this sense, two components detach him from Simmel's view on the process of objectification. On the one hand, the subjectivity brought into game in the analysis, and on the other, the conception of the cultural process of exteriorization in modernity. As it had been noticed, Benjamin analyzes the historical subject in collective terms, for which he draws upon the Marxist concept of class in a non-systematic and heterodox way. Besides, the process of cultural exteriorization relies on a dreaming consciousness. In such process, the utopian aspects of objective formations are involved and materialized in culture. Because of this, when analyzing revolutionary process, Benjamin considers the category utopian will to distinguish the double significance of the process of the revolutionary will, whose aspects are related to the first and the second nature. These are marginal categories in Benjamin's work, which can be read in notes he does away with the essay about the work of art. Still, they shed light and synthesize diverse and implicit aspects of his fragmentary theory about revolutionary processes. Benjamin writes, quotation, "A different utopian will, moreover, is asserted in revolutions, for apart from the utopia of the second nature, there is a utopia of the first, and the former is closer to realization than the latter. The more widely the development of humanity ramifies, the more openly utopias based on the first nature, and especially the human body, will give place to those relating to society and technology." End of quotation. Benjamin explains that the utopia of the first nature, the utopias of the first nature are related to love and death, and those of the second nature are related to the social and technical features. He harbors his hypothesis about revolutions by observing two concrete revolutionary processes, the Russian Revolution and the rise of German National Socialism. His examination lays emphasis on aspects of the first nature falling into oblivion in Soviet communism. Quotation, "By contrast, this aspect of utopia is a second-order priority in Russia." This is the one of the first nature, of course. Instead, the planning of collective existence is being combined with technical planning on a comprehensive planetary scale. End of quotation. As far as German fascism is concerned, it tries to block the problem by means of the slogan Blut und Boden. Benjamin thinks that the idea of blood is against the utopia of the first nature and the idea of soil against the second. With this analysis of contemporary historical processes, it is possible to observe a qualitative divergence between Simmel and Benjamin when presenting the process of culture objectification. The distance between them is founded upon the utopian component, almost absent in Simmel's thought and clearly present in Benjamin's late work. The process of the objectification is not conceived of as from the foundation of life, but from man as a being that produces objects as well as dreams. By conceiving the movement of exteriorization in political terms, Benjamin focuses on a collective subject who creates alienated forms, but who also leaves traces of those dreams and desires that have originally given birth to the fossilized forms that oppose them. History dynamics is marked not by a tragic process, but by the utopian possibilities of an imminent time stalled, waiting for redemption. And that's been all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. This was a very rich contribution with very important cornerstones from the fragment, Stefan Georg's circle, the concept of life, alienation, modernity and revolution. I think we could discuss longer than 15 minutes about that, but we make now a jump to the last speaker. And I think also this lecture will bring new perspectives in our workshop, because I think Simmel is seen in a focus of a more anthropological discourse, as far as I understand Dariusz' title. The title is Eccentric Experience in Helmuth, Plessner and Georg Simmel. Please, Dariusz.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Let me just try to share my screen, and you will tell me if it works. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Perfectly well.
Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, perfectly well.
Yes. Good, perfect. Thank you. Sorry. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to show you essentially 10 slides. And because Plessner is, I'm assuming, less familiar to everyone than the the other characters that we've discussed, rightly so, I have decided to visualize or write out as much as possible in order for it to sort of make some sense, I hope. The first thing I want to say is I will be speaking quite a bit about the idea of positionality and orientation. So let me just tell you very quickly about the background of the first slide, because the background of the first slide is where I live. So you might think this is to brag. It's Whitley Bay, northeast of England. It's a beautiful coast, amazing, beautiful beach. The average temperature of water is about 8 degrees centigrade. So it's bloody cold. It's the North Sea. So it's not like you can go for a swim, but you can go for a beautiful walk. So this is simply to sort of position myself in relationship to you. Otherwise, we're all sort of speaking in a bit of a vacuum. So I'd like to anchor things a little more. Okay, so eccentric experience. What is that? Well, let me start in the least familiar place. Let me start with Helmuth Plessner. Plessner is an interesting figure in the history of sociology and philosophy. In a way, he's a bit of a zombie figure. He is sort of marginal and central at the same time. And in fact, you could say he's eccentric himself. He is connected to some of the major intellectual movements and personalities of the 20th century. So for instance, he studied with Husserl. He knew Adorno. In fact, he was replacing Adorno's teaching or taking up Adorno's teaching after the war at the newly reconstituted Frankfurt Institute when Adorno was still in California. Plessner came in and was asked to step in for his teaching. So just give you a sense of his centrality within those circles. And of course, he was the contemporary of Heidegger. And he always complained that Heidegger's Being and Time, Sein und Zeit, came out in 1927, 1 year before his magnum opus, his major work, which is The Levels of Organic Life, 1928. And he always thought that because of that, his work was not given due attention. And there's some truth to that. Sort of Heidegger stole all the limelight, whereas I think actually Plessner has a different but an equally interesting argument. So Plessner is sort of making a comeback a little bit in the English-speaking literature because he is now, for the first time, being translated properly into English. So, for instance, his principal work, you see the cover of the English translation, Levels of Organic Life, Die Stufen des Organischen in der Mensch, Einleitung in die philosophische Anthropologie. That's the full title. It's only been translated in 2019, 3 years ago. Right? So he's fairly unknown, but he's a very interesting transitional figure because he is transitional in several respects. He is, in a sense, someone who completes Simmel's, and not only Simmel's, but also Dilthey's Lebensphilosophy by introducing real biology into his philosophy and into his theory. And he also straddles the two worlds of sociology and philosophy. So in fact, after the war, he was at different times both the president of the German Sociological Association and the German Philosophical Society, right? So he's an interesting figure that you couldn't quite call him marginal, but I think he's someone who is, I would say, adjacent to all of these amazing movements that we've been discussing for so long, and I think has a very interesting and a particular take on various aspects that could actually enlarge and enlighten various aspects of the things that we're grappling with. So my argument here is that, in a way, there's this sort of interesting conversation between Simmel and Plessner, because Simmel in many ways anticipates Plessner, and the first quotation you see here is actually from Plessner, 1928, which could have actually come from Simmel. Everything that is alive exhibits discontinuity in its continuity. I mean, if you wanted to distill Simmel into a formula, that is Simmel in many ways. We've heard it throughout every single presentation. That formula is repeating itself. But so Simmel anticipates him, but Plessner actually completes Simmel in a way. So I will show you how that is happening and how I'm thinking about it. And the connecting tissue here is the idea of eccentric experience that is basically found throughout Simmel's writing, but it is especially apparent in Simmel's 1911 essay on the adventure or adventure, das Abenteuer. And this is where I'm going to go with this. So let me give you a little more of historical context, because I think that's important. Simmel dies in 1918. So he's the child of the fin de siècle. He's the traumatized intellectual of World War I, and he dies in 1918. Plessner is the child of the 1920s Weimar Republic, right? The chaotic, amazing sort of creative, premonition to fascism and Nazism, the sort of, age of cynical reason that Sloterdijk actually talks about in the critique of cynical reason. Both have a specific and special relationship to modernity, and that is to a specific notion of crisis of modernity. Now, I'm not going to speak much about crisis because in my other paper, that is now sort of, in the second revision for Theory, Culture, and Society, I speak a lot about crisis and experience. But what I want to concentrate is actually on the connection between Simmel and Plessner, which actually I have to write out of the original paper. So Simmel anticipates, so both of them are sort of a responses to the current condition of life, right, if you will. Both, both address, there's a continuity you could draw from Simmel to Plessner. Almost like if you think of a race, you could see that Plessner sort of takes up the baton that Simmel has provided through Lebens's philosophy, right? So Simmel anticipates theoretically what Plessner is to live and work into his own philosophy. And as I said, and whereas Simmel talks about cultural life and life in a more abstract reality, although he does give us a very concrete cultural and social examples, fashion, erotic life is one of his favorite ones. Plessner actually takes biological sciences, inspired by people like Johann von Uexküll, for instance, and his notion of Umwelt, and works it into his theoretical approach to Lebens's philosophy, which actually becomes then philosophical anthropology. So the main difference between Simmel and this sort of more abstract Lebens's philosophy that comes out of Dilthey is the fact that Simmel brings in the physical body into the mix, actual human physicality that is absolutely central to his entire theory. So the main distinction in Plessner is between being a body and having a body. And that is also a main distinction between the animal world and the human world. The animal lives through its environment. It does not make a distinction between itself and whatever surrounds it. The human being makes that distinction. In fact, you could say that the human being is always already estranged from his environment because it perceives itself as not only being a body, but also having a body. And that idea of having a body is actually a separation, right? We're always already separated from, and that separation has to be filled in somehow. And this is where culture and various other symbolic realms come in. This is in essence what Plessner calls eccentric positionality of the human. Whereas the animal is the centric, it's centered within its own worldview and does not make a distinction between itself and its environment. The human is constitutionally eccentric, right? And behaviorally eccentric, because then creativity comes into it as well as at one point. So we can actually talk about that. So Plessner talks about a different type of awareness, an eccentric awareness or perception that is opposed to purely dualistic subjective-objective splitting, right? This sort of standard philosophical one. In fact, in the first chapter of this book, Levels of Organic Life, he basically goes after Descartes and precisely that split, right, of subject versus object. So the notion of positionality and boundary are absolutely crucial for Plessner because he's not interested in critique, a la sort of standard critical theory. He's not interested in any sort of form of transcendental philosophy, or even standard phenomenology that sort of separates you off from the judgment of the world in some ways. But he's really much interested in positioning of yourself through perception towards the world, right? And he's really interested in the boundary condition where the change of perception actually happens, the threshold of perception. So there's an interesting jump from the animal to the human, which goes from being centered and being decentered to being eccentric. So philosophical anthropology puts experience at the core. You're not surprised to hear that, erlebnis, right? That form of experience, not Erfahrung, but erlebnis. But it's more than just an academic pursuit. And this is absolutely crucial as well. Because as Joas and Honeth pointed out already some time ago, quote, philosophical anthropology met with great public interest and assumed an almost fashionable character, which was to be surpassed only by existential philosophy. So in a way, it is a movement. It is much closer to almost like an avant-garde movement than just an academic philosophy or an academic pursuit. Another thing about philosophical anthropology is that it breaks down academic boundaries, especially among philosophy, biology, and the human sciences. So if you wanted to have a model or for sort of an early history of what today we might call interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, philosophical anthropology is really the first modern attempt to create a sort of a transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary science that would meld various disciplines together. Now, to give you a sort of more complete picture, obviously Plessner is not the only representative of philosophical anthropology. There's also someone called, Arnold Galen, who's also struggling with the very similar issues. The only difference between Galen and Plessner is what type of experience they think defines the human condition. For Galen, it is the irrational experience. It is the fact that human being is basically a defective life form, which actually frees it to express itself in a creative way. Whereas for Plessner, it is really the immediate self-experience, the experience of the boundary that defines your type of environment, meaning human versus non-human, especially. And that's another strength or an interesting aspect of Plessner, that he is incorporating the idea of non-human into his philosophy, unlike all the other Leibniz philosophy before him, I think. So in this sense, human experience becomes eccentric, but it also becomes creative. So, there we go. There we go. So let's look at eccentricity in a little bit closer view. Essentially, if we take the sort of historical context that I just related to you, eccentricity is really, on its most basic level, a response to a crisis. A response to a crisis of basically of the crisis of the relationship between meaning and life. I think it was Francisco who actually mentioned that at one point. In Simmel, there's this constant search for a relationship between meaning and life, and that search continues. And at one point, that search becomes a political crisis in the 1920s. It's not only a political, it's not only an academic or a cultural or an artistic pursuit, but it becomes a political crisis of various perspective vying for position with some very dramatic and impactful consequences. So eccentricity is a response to that. So it comes from the fundamental doubt in our self-knowledge, right? And this, for Plessner, is precisely the sort of the touch point, the spark that actually triggers our direct contact with reality. So the only way to fill in that gap is to renew it or creatively fill it in, but by artificial creations, by artifice, by artificiality. And that's where culture comes in. So there's this perpetual sense of crisis, but there's also this constitutional imbalance between the achieved and the imagined, right? And that imbalance is there because eccentricity, or our positioning, our human immediacy, does not allow us or does not permit us the unequivocal fixing of our own position, right? So it's our take on life, if you will, our self-identity, if you want to use that term, is something that constantly undermines itself. We are something that constantly annuls our own thesis, right? This is how we liberate and create experiences. This is how we trigger creativity. But this is also how we feel estrangement, alienation, and unfamiliarity, right? But again, here, I think the notion here is of a fundamental estrangement that is inevitable but it's also productive, right? And in some ways it is productive because it is inevitable, right? So one way of thinking about this entire model is to think of eccentricity and its relationship to life through this idea of xenocommunication, which is actually not my term, but it comes from modern media theories, Mackenzie work. Xenocommunication, where it's sort of communication with the strange, with the alien part of reality, which again, it's not about content, but it's about framing, right? Of pushing of boundaries, of what is considered to be communicable, or what is considered to be available for communication, right? So this is where things become a little more tricky, because they go outside of the social and outside of the cultural sphere, strictly speaking. So if you wanted to sort of, and you know, most of the book, you know, more than half of the book is basically trying to create new descriptions for this very sort of intuitive but very difficult aspect of thinking about the eccentricity of experience. So another way of thinking about it is to say that to be eccentrically positioned means that the living subject has an indirect, direct relationship to everything. It's a constantly mediated relationship, but it's a mediation that is not sort of hidden, or it's not in the sort of Hegelian cunning of reason sense, but it's a mediation as a specific method of living or technique of living that needs to happen as a matter of course, right? And again, xenocommunication comes into this in the double sense of communication with what is strange, but also a hospitality towards what is alien. And that might be, you know, overly positive, maybe precisely when we get into trouble, when crisis hit, where various other disasters hit, is precisely when hospitality turns into hostility towards what is alien. And actually, as you know, hospitality and hostility are close etymological relatives, right? You can think back to that famous Derrida essay on hospitality. So that's Plessner. Now, if you go back to Simmel, you'll pretty much find an entire outline of Plessner's argument in Das Abenteuer in Simmel in 1911. Because Simmel defines adventure as precisely something that is ripped out of the standard continuity of life, something that is discontinuous, something that is estranged from life, but still part of life, expressive of it in a more vivid form than perhaps this sort of drone or continuous unaware existence would lead us to believe. So again, there's this standard sort of duality and tension between, you know, big things and low things, between chance and necessity, you know, between intellect and just sort of pure instinct. All of that is sort of, Simmel is trying to always find, he's searching for a form where those opposing forces of life could actually find the most vivid expression, and something that we could then apply hopefully to other things. So adventure for Simmel is a type of experience. And he actually says it is like a foreign body in our existence, which is yet somehow connected to the center. So he's thinking of this sort of centric, eccentric topography. It is where the outside becomes an aspect of the inside, and which this is interesting because if you go back to Simmel's essay on the stranger, you realize that this is exactly what he says about the stranger. Stranger is someone who stands apart, but is still a part of community, right? He's a potential wanderer who stays today, but might leave tomorrow. So actually, if you want to understand the famous essay on the stranger in Simmel, I think the key is actually found in the adventure, in the experience of the adventure or the adventurer. So what else is the adventure for Simmel? Well, it is independent of time. It is independent of history, of standard before and after. And that's, you know, sort of chronological continuity. And I think we spoke about that throughout our sessions, whether, you know, it's his writing on Rodin or Rembrandt, or, you know, he's always looking for those isolated moments where you can pluck them out of continuity of life. And in isolation, but still connected to that continuity, they would actually be more informative, more expressive of that life. So he actually uses a very poetic phrase: adventure is like an island of life, where life as a whole still shows itself, albeit in a condensed form, right? But it's also a question of creativity and shaping of experience. And I think that is very important. Like in Plessner, that's very important, because there's a profound affinity for Simmel between the adventurer and the artist, right? The artist, again, is that personality that is detached partly from life, right? That finds his or her own rhythm, you know, logic, that is able to shape their own experience away from the sort of centralized, proscribed social and cultural and political parameters, right? So there's that sort of communication. So creativity and shaping of experience are actually very important here. And adventure is a form of extraterritoriality. At one point, I think Simmel says it is an exclave, not an enclave, right? With respect to the continuity of life. It's creative reconfiguration, but he always makes the point, but it's not fully detached, right? It is still connected to the core of that life, in some ways more so than the actual life. And again, if I think back to the essay on Rembrandt, that's exactly what he says about Rembrandt's portraits, you know, where the entire life is distilled into the facial expression of a figure that is being portrayed. So to conclude, essentially, what are we talking about here? Well, in a microcosm of Plessner and Simmel, we can say that Simmel anticipates Plessner, Plessner completes Simmel, right? The adventure achieves a central feeling of life, which runs through the eccentricity of the adventure and produces a new significant necessity of life. So actually, Simmel at one point does, in passing, call adventure an eccentric type of experience, right? The adventure is also, that's very important, not something completely accidental. It's not a hodgepodge of chance and necessity, but some sort of new incomparable experience. That's what he's after. He's after the incomparable experience, which can be interpreted only as a particular encompassing of the accidentally external by the internally necessary. So again, he's after this connection between the inner and the outer, the grand and the sort of structural, superstructural, and the microcosmic, right? Whether or not he finds it an adventure is another question, but Plessner precisely takes that sort of thing and calls it the eccentric positionality, right? So eccentric experience is one of anticipation, right? As much of presence for Plessner. It is cumulative. It is the cumulative result of possibility that has been historically decided for now, but through a string of communicative breakthroughs that put together the limits the world for us. This is how actuality and possibility act in concert, creating a conditional being, which belongs to the actual reality, but through possibility does not, right? So there's this sort of openness, in other words, the essence of experience and the human reality must remain constantly open. And this is where I think not only the interesting connection between Simmel and Plessner on a sort of theoretical level are to be found, but actually this is where Plessner becomes really interesting in terms of trying to distill and make sense of the current experience that seems to be as chaotic and as crisis-ridden as ever before. So I think I'll stop there, and I know I've thrown a lot at you, but at least there's a C behind it. So I don't know if that makes a difference or not. Anyway, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dariusz. You open the door to another field And so one can see how broad the perspective in Simmel are, because on the one hand, he is in a communication, in a complex communication with what we call later the critical theory. And here is a quite different access. I only want to mention that Simmel was very productive also for cultural anthropology in the United States, for example. Yeah? So we have a lot of more influences. And during your lecture, had nevertheless a tiny bit of time to meditate that we have so many lectures of from Simmel to Benjamin, Plessner and Simmel, and Lukács and Simmel. And I think this is also quite interesting. It could have to do with our perspectives, to see him only as a forerunner, but we have also the choice to say that his theories and concept are broader than the successors, so to say. But I don't want to start a discussion. I'm the chair, so please be sportive and put some questions to our excellent referent and speakers. Amalia, thank you that you start.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed both presentations. I would have two questions. The first one to Dariusz in connection to maybe a missing link in this history to Karl Mannheim. Yesterday, Vera Savary mentioned Mannheim also as a student by Simmel, and I think you know these polemics between Mannheim and Plessner at the end of the 20s as Mannheim's Ideologie und Utopie appeared. And I think it could be a very good connection, two concepts inspired by Simmel, and with a conclusion which shows in a very other direction. Dariusz, I don't know whether I speaking on evident connections.
No. I mean, no, thank you for that. Yes, absolutely. I mean, the interesting aspect here is the aspect of the idea of production of knowledge. I mean, you could actually bring in not only Mannheim, but you can actually bring in Cassirer into it, and the entire symbolic philosophy, you know, the human as homo symbolicus, right? Where, I mean, this is what Plessner is after, that his human sphere of eccentricity is precisely the production of artifice, which is symbolic artifice, because humans don't have any other way of filling in that distance. As soon as they become aware that you're not simply, that you also have a body, you're not just a body, you know, the contrast is this disturbing element in human existence, right? It's the fact that we slightly, you know, I mean, you can go back to, I mean, this is as old as human history, right? You can go back to the Garden of Eden when human beings for the first time realized that they're naked, right? So right away, that act of knowledge, right, that is so inscribed in our sort of Judeo-Christian tradition of feeling your own nakedness is actually an act of separation, an act of awareness that you have a body. And as soon as you have a body, what do you need to do with it? You need to cover it, right? And as soon as you need to cover it, you think of clothing, you've got technology, you've got symbolic language, you know, and this is the expulsion from our sense of innocence, right? So in a way, yes, absolutely, you're right. It's that idea of knowledge not as a sort of assumed background sort of context, but actually an active way of directing the symbolic in order to design a specific type of experience. So I think in that sense, there's a definite link there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Amalia, you mentioned that you had a second question.
Yeah, María, if I may, yes. my English is very bad. I'm very sorry. Your notion, collective subject, has inspired me to this question, and I would like to ask you whether you see a difference in this notion, collective subject, regarding the text by Benjamin, like Moskauer Tagebuch, on his texts on Moscow, on the Soviet Union, and in other texts by Benjamin, where this collective subject, like in context by Neapel, we have mentioned after the lecture by Michaela, the notion of porosität in this regard, his text on Nizza, on Carnival, on all these collective phenomena in Italy, in this core European territory. Do you see a difference between his position, the collective subject, in Russian context and in this Italian Mediterranean context? I'm not sure if I could explain it.
I don't know if I get the question very well, but thank you very much for your intervention. I believe that we can see two different ways of tackling the problem of the subject in Benjamin in respect to the individual subject and the collective one. And in the texts about Naples and his experiences in travels in Italy, there are many different narrations in which Benjamin, in a way, is thinking and reflecting over the subject, but in a way in which he is experiencing and experimenting with narration and with experiences as well. And I believe that in a way, this is a way of experimenting a different way of tackling the problem of the liberal subject. He's trying the liberal individual. You can see that in many of his experiments with narration, and this is very much clear with the relationship he establishes with surrealism, and you can also see it in the way he is interested in the notion of I have lost you, of Rausch, which is important for him to think of a new way of thinking the individual, the individual subject. When regarding the collective subject, he repeats and he always goes back to the concept of collective unconscious, which is very important for him in different essays, and as well, and very important in the in Das Passagenwerk, of course. This is not systematic. The problem with Benjamin, I believe, it's always the same. We can never find a systematic concept of the collective subject. He is kind of finding different aspects of the concept, but he never defines it. This is, I mean, probably has a lot of reasons. One, I think, a very important biographical reason, the conditions of his work, of course, and also the way he develops his thought, which is very much very far from any academic orthodox way of thinking. Well, I don't know if I answered your question. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
put a question to Dariusz. Yesterday you spoke after my lecture, Dariusz, on this difference between alienation and estrangement. And my simple question is the eccentric position, which is in the center of Plessner's reflection. This is the condition of the possibility of estrangement. This is the consequence, or have I understood that right? And the second is a commentary I saw on Hans Blumenberg, the absolutism of reality. And this seems to me influenced by Blumenberg, by Plessner and by Simmel too. So we could also propose a lecture on Simmel and Plessner and Blumenberg, but this is only a commentary.
No, actually, that sounds interesting in a sense that in a way, in Plessner, there is no absolutism of reality, because reality is simply that this immediacy that you face. You have no choice but to deal with it in an estranged way, right? So but in a way, yes. So, you're sort of forced into a certain type of experience from the start, which you have no choice in choosing, but then you have a choice how to shape it. And I suppose then it makes a difference aesthetically what sort of experience is created through that, right? So
I want to say that was called, but was Blumenberg calls the absolutism of reality. This is a crisis, This is the point for reacting, And for the situation. In this way, I thought there could be a connection between those two concepts.
Well, crisis is interesting because crisis, I've written crisis out of this paper, but I have an entire paper on crisis and experience that takes it away from the idea of crisis as a form of emergency, but crisis as a type of experience that is, again, creative. It's a decision-making experience of judgment, which takes it back again to aesthetics. So yeah, there's a lot there to work with, Wolfgang, conceptually, if you want to. It'll make you cry, I promise.
I have also a question to Maria, because I found your answer of the looking for a collective subject, but it is failing. I would like to say that is a fate of the critical theory as such. Also, Adorno didn't find this kind of collective subject, but only resisting forms of modernistic arts, for example. And also in this way, Simmel and Benjamin are to some extent forerunners, predecessors. I have initiated with friends in Italy a conference, Benjamin and Gramsci, and this is interesting because of the differences. So Gramsci was to some extent successful, not personally successful, with regard to that idea of a collective subject, the marginalized subject. But Benjamin and his circle not. Have you an idea why Benjamin and after him Adorno and others failed?
I think it's a very important and interesting point, the one of the collective subject in Benjamin, because at the same time I think it would be I think it is quite different from Adorno in the sense that Benjamin is eager to find a collective subject in a way, but at the same time he's very much reluctant to define it and to define the collective subject. And he's more thinking in the process of history and cannot, I think, find a way to define this subject. But I don't think he is not interested, or that I think it's a matter of perhaps of the way he is interchanging the criticism of the individual subject at the same time, because he is very much aware of the fact of the critical point in which the liberal subject is at that moment. And I think this is to do with his impossibility to define this collective subject in a way. Maybe this is a clue to that, but it is true that it's problematic in a way.
Muchas gracias. Thank you. Some more questions? We are all tired from the whole half day, tired. If this is a case, I think Francisco and I would give some information, make some proposals, and I would like to beg Francisco to start with some ideas. What is not possible at the moment is that we make conclusion about the whole workshop. This was so many different and inspiring ideas, and we need. I personally speaking, I need some time for orientation. Yeah, so I cannot make orientation for you. I don't think it's necessary and possible. But what is possible are some technical and points, or the question of publication. We have two ideas, Francisco and me, and I want to beg you, Francisco, to start with the first idea, with the Barcelona coup.
Thank you, Wolfgang. I will silence you, but by all means, just turn your microphone on if you want to speak. Yes, regarding publication, we have two ideas that can perfectly work together. On the one hand, after a suggestion of Esteban Wernick, we asked this Catalonia-based scientific journal Digitum, which is a very well-known scientific journal in sociology. If we could publish the results, I mean, if we could publish the papers of this workshop, and they have shown interest, and they have been very, very welcoming about the idea. So the responsible editor of the journal is Natalia Cantó-Milà, which is a very well-known Simmelian expert. And the idea is that we publish in Spanish, at least, the papers. So for that, we will ask you. We will write the details. We will write to you about the details later, but we will ask you about. We ask your papers, and we'll somehow translate them into Spanish. But we are planning to have a meeting with Natalia Cantó-Milà next week, and after the meeting, we will communicate the details and times and everything. But that's one proposal, and probably Wolfgang can speak about the second one.
We have talked about the possibility of a German, or maybe German-English. I would prefer a German edition at Königshausen and Neumann, and our friend Clemens Ruttner and his companion Wahidin Preljevic, they have a series at Königshausen and Neumann about Identität and some other keywords, and I think this workshop could fit very well in this series, and have spoken briefly with Clemens, but I would do that next week. And I also want to mention that I could imagine that we include some more texts, especially for the Königshausen and Neumann edition, but also it would be also possible for the Barcelona digital edition. I would like, and I have asked that Tatiana, who chaired in the morning, in your morning, in our noon time, but there would be other options to ask colleagues or make proposals to Francisco and me, arguing. I have one more interesting person with regard to Simmel. I think we should collect some more texts in which Simmel is more central. Yeah, this is, but I will not, I cannot influence that very well. Yeah, that would be the proposals, and we stay in contact, hopefully, in this or in other ways. This is not, for me, it's not the first time that I work together with a lot of you. And we will inform you about what will happen with the publication. We cannot promise all, but especially the Barcelona digital version is very probable, and I think also the Königshausen and Neumann has good chances, either in a series or maybe also as a lonesome traveler in the publishing house of Königshausen and Neumann. Some more questions, practical questions. The good thing is of digital conference, I say, please send me your tickets, please send me your costs and so on. But nevertheless, I hope to see the one or the other quite soon in reality. And I think Francisco, and I want to repeat my thanks to Francisco and his colleagues that organizing this digital conference so generously. Muchas gracias, many thanks, herzlichen Dank. It was a challenge that has to do with Simmel, that he's to some extent a queer in philosophical discourse in 20th century, but it has also to do with our languages, Spanish, German, English, Spanish, Hungarian, etc., etc. And so I'm very happy, I have to say that very honestly and open, to reread some of the papers in Spanish, in German, or in English. Once again, thank you very much, and I will give Francisco the last word for saying goodbye from virtual Buenos Aires.
Thank you. Thank you all, and thank you very much for your presentations, and thank you for being so generous to us and saying yes to participate. And yeah, I hope to see you hopefully in person in not a so distant future. And in any ways, we'll keep in touch, and we'll write to you very, very soon regarding the publication proposals. Once again, very, very thankful for your contributions, and that's it. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening, afternoon.
Thanks,
everyone.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Herzlichen Dank. Grazie.
Dank.
Thanks.
Ciao, ciao.